You know, I wasn't one of those rich kids that had a CD player yet. I turned that up on the radio. Everybody wants to rule the world. That was what I wanted to do. I wanted to rule the world. I wanted to be rich and famous. I wanted to have it all. I had plans going off to college, right? I was going to get a degree in business. I was going to do the fat corporate paycheck, be fabulously wealthy, rule the world. I grew up in church. Really didn't have much to do with it, right? Didn't care too much. Grew up in a pastor's home. My mom, she was a pastor for a long time. We went every time the doors were open. Of course, you would, being a pastor's family. But I really didn't get too worked up about it, right? I think my freshman year out at USC, I only went to church one time because this guy dragged me to it. It was at the Shrine Auditorium right off of campus. That's where they hold the Emmys or the Oscars or something, or they did, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, the Shrine. Anyway, went to church there. Didn't really have much to do with it. But then, junior year of college, I had the aha moment, right? Where it all became real. Where I actually decided that I was going to be a disciple of Jesus, that I was convinced that it was all true. I was ready to roll with this. I was all in, right? I had that moment, that aha moment. And I was all in. Couldn't stop smiling for 2 months. Went to every church service I could get my hands on. Didn't matter which church it was. I was all in. Okay? And then graduation came. And I was looking for the fat corporate job, right? And I couldn't even get a second interview with any of my accounting firms that I was going with. And God was knocking. I want you to become a pastor. No. I knew what pastor's life looked like. I knew that I was going to have to, make some changes. Reluctantly, I decided to join up and go to seminary so I could become a pastor. And when I went there, they had me fill out all these personality tests. You know the ones. Do you believe someone's watching you from behind trees? Do you hear voices in the middle of the night? Those I failed, but they let me in anyway. And I remember sitting with Ted Stoneberg. He was a professor of psychology at the time, and he was walking me through them. He looked like Eisenhower. Strangely. Anyway, and Stoneberg says, Aaron, it looks like you're upset about the loss of something. It looks like you're upset about something, losing something. And Stoneberg was right. But we're going to talk about that in just a little bit, so bear with me on that. Today, though, everybody, I want to talk to you about how Jesus the Messiah reveals the nature of God by pouring himself out for others. We're going to talk about how Jesus, the Messiah, reveals God the Father by pouring himself out for other people. Okay? That beautiful piece of Paul, Philippians chapter 2, verses 9 through about 11 that I've read to you so many times. Though not considering it something to exploit, he emptied himself and took on the form of a slave. So everybody, if we were to ask all of us, and we were to ask everybody we knew, describe for me God. Just describe God. What do you suppose we would hear? What were the answers that we would hear? Describe for me God. Well, we would start hearing, after a lot of chin scratching and of course the silly answers, we might hear those big words, all the omni words, omniscient and omnipresent and omnipotent, all the omnis, all-knowing, all-powerful, everywhere at once, all of those big words. But I wonder how many of us would say, look at Jesus. You want to know what God's like? You look at Jesus. Would you have said that? I'm not sure. You want to know what God is like? You look at Jesus. Jesus said in John 14, verse 9, boys, why are you asking me to show you the Father? You have seen me, so you have seen the Father. I reveal the Father perfectly. Do not say, show me the Father. I have shown you. So, church, we know that Jesus reveals the Father. It is a uniquely Christian confession that God is revealed by Jesus the Messiah. So when we want to know what God looks like, let us look to Jesus, perfectly revealing Him. So in today's passage, this Philippians 2, Paul writing about Jesus who pours Himself out, perfectly reveals the Father. Perfectly reveals the Father. Though God Himself, God of very God, right? Jesus, the Logos, pre-existent with God in Trinity, eternal relationship. Even though in God of very God, He did not consider that position, that power, something to be used, something to be kept, something to be manipulated. Jesus did not want, in that way, to rule the world. We read how Jesus was anything but that. He took on the form of you and I. He became like us so that He might enter into this world and become like us, that He might defeat sin and death and evil on the cross. He emptied Himself. He gave up everything, and literally everything. I mean, can we even wrap our heads around this? This is God. I mean, it wasn't like He gave up a week of vacation in the Hamptons or something, right? Or he decided not to drive his boat down the river one day. No, this is giving up everything so that He might be born in a cave outside Bethlehem a long time ago, live this hard scrabble life, and eventually end up dying at our hands. That is everything. He gave up everything to be the Redeemer of the world, you and I. He poured Himself out. He emptied Himself for those He loved. He poured Himself out. That's the theme of today's service. And Paul goes on to say that He didn't come to win us by His superpower, Jesus' stature, right? Dun, dun, dun. Hello, I'm superhero Jesus. I can fly. I can become invisible. Right? That wasn't Jesus at all. That's what the devil was tempting Jesus to be in the desert. Jesus, you should be the king in the normal ways. You should be the Superman king. You should be the powerful king. You should be the rich king. I will give you these things, and you don't have to go to the cross to be king, Jesus. And Jesus said, get behind me. He also said the same thing to Peter just some time later. Jesus, you don't want to be king that way. And Jesus said to him, get behind me, Satan. Right? Because that is not the poured out Jesus way. So everyone, this Jesus, this emptied one, this humbled one, this dying one, in Him we see God. And I can't reiterate that enough. In this humbled, poured out, dying Jesus, we see God the Father. And so when someone asks you, or you ask yourself, what is God like? Look to Jesus. When someone says to you, hey, what's Christianity all about? You say, let me tell you about Jesus, the poured out, emptied, humble one. The one who gave everything for those who hated Him. Because that's who God is. That's who we are. The poured out people. So let me finish my story here about my time in college with Stoneberg. He said, you seem to be mourning the loss of something. You're upset about the loss of something. And I confessed to him. I said, yeah, you know what? I am. All those hopes and dreams of, like the fat corporate paycheck and all of that stuff. I was mourning the loss of that. I was mourning the loss of all of my dreams of grandeur and power, anything but humility. I was mourning the loss of all of that stuff because I knew that I was going to have to give up something to be a pastor. Not just something. I was going to have to give up just about everything to become a pastor. I knew that's where that was going, and it did not set well with me. I love you, God, but I'm sure none of you have ever said such thing to God. That's just me. Okay? I knew that in answering the call of God, being a serious Jesus person, I was going to have to turn my back on some things that I held dear. You know, I still sing that song. I'll still turn, everybody wants to rule. I love that the electronic music. I love that part. I turn that part up. But that's not me anymore. Now, my song that I switched to was U2 Joshua Tree album. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Consequently, over the last 25 years, a little bit of growing up, I have found what I'm looking for. But, church, we have to realize that if we're going to be serious Jesus people, if we're going to be a serious church, we're going to have to kind of find that thing that I did and turn our back on some things that need our back turned to. We need to turn our back to some things in our lives that impede us because they do not reflect the humble, poured out Jesus who reflects perfectly God the Father. And I think we all know what we're talking about. Right? It's different for each of us, but we all know what we are hearing. And you know, Paul was writing to this church. He says, "Church, I love you, but." And so to us, let us hear this. God loves us, but sometimes there's things we need to turn away from because we are not poured out people. We are not a poured out church. We can be an arrogant church that does not reflect Jesus, does not reflect God. We are to be those who are servants, those who are humble, those who are merciful, those who are forgiving 70 times 7 on the same day for the same thing. That whole tough love stuff, all right, that doesn't really work with God, does it? You ever worry that God would walk away from you because you keep messing up the same way over and over again? Jesus, how many times should I forgive? 7? No, I tell you, 70 times 7 on the same day for the same thing. Humble, forgiving. Jesus says, you will be self-sacrificing if you are my follower. You will be those who take up the cross just as I did. You will be those who make peace, not war. You will be those who forgive, those who do not hold grudges. You will be those who, like me, who is like the Father. You will be those who are poured out, for that is the Christ way. Now, hear this promise, and I say it to myself. One day, okay, right now, things can get tough. One day, everything's going to be good. Right? One day, when the trumpet sounds, the dead in Christ rise, and we hear Jesus say, "Enter into my rest, for with you I am well pleased." There will be payback for all of the stuff that we feel we've given up. Right? Like that song by Mercy Me, I can only imagine. If you really think about that, that may bring tears to your eyes. But right now, church, it is for us to be those who are self-sacrificing, those who are serving, those who are merciful. It is not for us to be arrogant and prideful. It is not for us to be those who take instead of give. Because one day our vindication will come. One day our vindication will come, and we will be made like him in the twinkling of an eye. Is that Shakespeare? Look that up. If you find that in the Bible, I'll bake you bread. If you find a donkey where Mary rode to Jerusalem, Bethlehem, I'll buy you a steak dinner. That's not today. So if you're paying attention here, everyone, Paul was writing this to a church. Paul was writing these words to a church that evidently wasn't getting along too well. I know it's not ever happened in this church, but you may have heard of it in other churches. People who snipe at one another. People who say derogatory things about one another. People who may gossip. People who may disagree on carpet colors or window hangings or styles of this and that. Paul was saying to them, hey, listen, y'all. You be like Jesus. You look to this one, this humble humility, this one who gave everything. You look to him in your church life. We look to Jesus, this humble one, in our own lives because Paul couldn't stand self-aggrandizement in any form because it is not God. He says, you look to this Jesus who is the reflection of the Father. Right? Guys, because Jesus perfectly epitomizes God the Father likeness in his self-giving, self-sacrificing, poured outness. So you look to Jesus and you look to God in this way. And so today I'd like to call us all to this life of humility, this life of poured outness. I would invite all of us to hear. You remember that song we all learned in Sunday school? This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. You remember that song? Hide it under a bushel? No, I'm going to let it shine. Sometimes we can hide our light under a bushel of bickering and selfishness in the church. Sometimes we can hide I'm really working on this. Going to grocery stores in La Crosse tests my salvation every time. It's like my own personal Via Dolorosa, going to Woodman's. I pick up your cross. I pick up my cross at the door. Sometimes I put it down and pick up the hammer and I say, Jesus, help me. I'm a jerk in Woodman's. God, forgive me. We shouldn't be that way. We should be the people who pick up the cross all the time and walk and do not cover our light with our bad attitudes, do not cover our light with our selfishness, do not cover our light with everybody wants to rule the world. And this church would stand as a beacon of hope and humility to all of this area and around the world. And that's something to think about. Let us not focus upon silly things. Let us not focus upon making ourselves comfortable. Let us focus upon being for others. Like C.S. Lewis said, being humble isn't thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. Let us do that. Let us be those who think of other people. Being this kind of people, and I end with this, being these kind of people, these selfless, humble people, being these kind of people may make us uncomfortable for the moment. It may make us uncomfortable for the moment, may make us give up our plans of grandeur and some things that we thought we had, just like it did a young college student in 1994. But the way of Christ is fulfilling and rich. So let us take this journey together. Amen. It's communion time. My favorite part of the service. Now,